Yevamos Daf contains 3 Mishnayos. It begins with the topic of somebody who had 5 wives who went to Medina Siyam and they all died, or at least he heard they all died and it wasn't true, and they were all sisters of each other. What the halacha is in that case. Then we'll get to the sugya, which will take us to the end of the parak through all 3 Mishnayos, and that's the sugya of a boy who is over 9 years old but under 13 years old. His bia counts as a technical bia, but he cannot do any kinyan of Kiddushin, Yibum, Get, or Maimer. The Gemara will discuss what his halacha is in relation to asering a Yevama on the other brothers, asering other Yevamos. What's the halacha if there are 2 such boys, and one does Yibum right after the other? Well, how does that count? And what's the halacha if he does Yibum and then he dies? What happens there? The Gemara will end with a bit of a garata about something that Rabbi Yochanan said, and he was upset that he wasn't quoted in his name, and why that is so important. So let's begin. We start with the Mishnah, a couple of lines into Daf Tzadi Vav. The Mishnah discusses the following scenario. Somebody was married. Man was married to a woman. She went to Medina Siyam. He heard that she died, so he married her sister through a father. Then the second wife went to Medina Siyam. He heard she died, and he married a sister of the second through a mother. So the first is the sister. The first wife is the sister of the second wife. The second wife is the sister of the third wife, but first and third are not related. The same thing happened a fourth and a fifth time, and now he ended up having married 5 women, each one a sister of the one immediately before and after, but not related to any of the other ones. So 1 and 2 are sisters, 2 and 3 are sisters, 3 and 4 are sisters, 4 and 5 are sisters, but none is related to any other ones. Then he finds out that all 5 are really alive. So what's the halacha here? So his marriage to his first wife, of course, counts because that was never broken. Therefore, his marriage to his second wife does not count because that was an achos isha and there's no tefisas kiddushin there. Because the marriage to the second wife doesn't count, the marriage to the third wife does count. The third is not related to the first. The third is related to the second, but the second isn't married to him. The fourth does not count because he's related to the third. And then the fifth does count because he's not related to the fourth. So it comes out he is married to wives number 1, 3, and 5. He's not married to wives number 2 and 4. Should he then die and a brother does yibum to either of the wives, 1, 3, and 5, they're all legally married to him, that yibum would pater all the other ones as tsaros of him. Now, what would be if the first wife really was dead, but all the other ones were not? So then the entire thing flips. He was not married to wife number 1 at the time he married wife number 2 because wife number 1 was dead. And wife number 2 is a legal marriage. Because 2 is a marriage, 3 is not. Because 3 is not, 4 is. And because 4 is, 5 is not. So now he's married to 2 and 5 and not married to... he's married to 2 and 4, that is, and he's not married to 3 and 5. Before we continue with the Mishnah, which continues on to a completely different subject, let's take a brief look at the Gemara's comment here. The Gemara analyzes the language of the Mishnah when it brings the second case, where the first wife had actually she did die, and therefore the man is married to the second and the fourth instead of the third and the fifth. The language of the Mishnah is that he marries the second after the death of the first. So the Gemara asks what do you mean? In the first case, he also married the second after he heard about the death of the first. The Gemara says, yeah, the difference is that here she really was dead. The Mishnah means that she really was actually dead. That's when he married the second, and therefore that marriage is chal, as opposed to the first case where he just thought she was dead and the marriage is not chal. Okay, let's go on to the rest of the Mishnah, which introduces the topic of a boy who's over age 9 but under age 13 who's doing yibum. This topic will take us to the rest of the parak through the next 2 Mishnayos. We need an introduction here on the concept of maimer. So, when a woman falls to yibum, the yavam has 4 possible reactions that he can do. He can do yibum, chalitza, those are 2 deraisa responses, or he could do maimer or a get. Yibum and chalitza are the appropriate responses. If he does yibum, that creates a marriage between them and asers any other action that comes afterwards. Any other action, any other bia, any other chalitza, anything that'll come afterwards from her tsaros, from his brothers. Anything else takes 0 effect, and that's because they are now married. Anything else is an Isser Eshesach. There's also an Isser to do 2 Yibums. He can't Yibum twice. 2 brothers can't do Yibum. 2 Tsaros can't do Yibum. It's the Isser of Bayis Achrubayin Abein Abein Shnei Batim, and therefore nothing takes effect afterwards. The same applies to Chalitza. Once he does a Chalitza, Kivin Shalei Bana Shuv Lo Yivne, he can't do anything afterwards. No action takes any effect afterwards. It's all Dvarim B'Telim. If, however, he does Maimer counts as a type of... Maimer is when he does Kedushin. It counts as a quasi-Kinyan, a quasi-Yibum Dirabanan. It does create the Isser of Einabayna Shnei Batim. The other brothers can't do anything. can't do a yibum or a maimer now. They can't, the other tsaros can't do anything. However, if they do, there is room for it to be chal. And it is chal, and now it creates an isser even on the first brother, because now both of them are in a problem. Both brothers who did a maimer, whatever they did, both are in a problem of shnei batim. And if there are two tsaros that both do maimer, they're both in a shnei batim situation, and therefore they're both usser. So there is room. Same thing applies if he gives a get, which is not an appropriate response to a yibum situation. Get is not meant to break up a zikas yibum. However, it does create a quasi derabanan state of loy boneh, of having rejected the yibum, and therefore there's a shuv lo yibne. They cannot continue. If they do, there'll be an iser. So again, to sum up, the difference between yibum and chalitza is that yibum and chalitza leave no room for anything to be chal afterwards. Maimer and get do leave room for something to be chal afterwards, and that's something which happens afterwards will create an iser even on the first brother, on the first one who did the maimer that he did. Now the Gemara is discussing the bia of a katan. A katan's bia counts from over age 9. From age 9 to 1 day counts as a bia, so technically it's a maisa bia. Were it to be an issur kares, for example, there would be an issur kares applied on whoever did it, and whoever was the adult involved. It could even be an issur skila, whatever it is. So it counts as a bia. However, he's not old enough to do a kinyan of yibum. He's not old enough to do a kiddushin either. He's not old enough to marry. Therefore, his bia has a quasi chalais, and the Gemara says, and the Mishnah is working with the assumption that it counts just like a maimer. Now, the Mishnah introduces and discusses the bia of the katan, and it says that it counts as a maimer. However, it's not the same as a maimer of a gadol. It's weaker than the maimer of a gadol. Now, how is it weaker? The maimer of a gadol, if you have one maimer after another, so we said that the second one, it takes effect. That's actually a machlokes, whether a maimer following a maimer can take effect. The maimer leaves room for a yibum afterwards. It doesn't leave room for a maimer afterwards. There's a machlokes, tanaim, on the chacham, which we'll see later. But the yibum, the maimer of a katan is going to be weaker, and that it definitely leaves room for a gadol afterwards. Also, it's weaker so that if a gadol did a maimer before, it doesn't leave room for anything for him to do afterwards. His yibum wouldn't be chaz anything afterwards. So the Mishnah discusses the case of the yibum that's done by a katan. It counts as a maimer, but it's weaker than a maimer of an adult. And therefore it says as follows. If it's the first thing that happens, it creates an iser, just like any maimer. If it's the second thing that happens, meaning a different brother did a maimer first, an adult brother did a maimer first, it doesn't create an iser now. It is weaker, it is hidden beyond the shadows of the maimer of the adult brother, and it doesn't create an iser. The other brothers, though, the adults, this Mishnah is working with the opinion that the two maimers do create an iser. And if the first one does yibum, and then if an adult brother does yibum first, it creates an iser. If an adult brother does yibum or maimer after the first brother did maimer, then that also creates an iser, one applied on top of the other. So the difference between an adult and a child is if the second action is done by an adult, it creates an iser on the first one. If the second action is done by a child, it doesn't create an iser, it's weaker. Now, the Gemara begins, and the Gemara says this cannot be talking about a bia, because we have a brisa brought by Rav and Rav who says that the bia of a katan does create an iser on a maimer of a gadol. That's the case if you have a woman falling to yibum, one brother who's an adult does maimer, everyone else is usher to do anything, but a katan who's over 9 years old then goes ahead and does bia. It creates an iser on the first brother who did the maimer, just as if it was an adult maimer. So the Gemara says, okay, so our Mishnah wasn't talking about the katan's yibum, our Mishnah was talking about the katan's maimer. If the katan does bia, that is strong enough to be equal to the maimer of the gadol, and it counts as two maimers, and we're going with the understanding that two maimers, the second one creates iser on the first one creates iser on the second one, everybody's usher because it's shnei batim. Our Mishnah was talking about where the katan does a maimer after a maimer. A katan's maimer is weaker than an adult's maimer, and therefore it doesn't create an iser if it follows the maimer of an adult. As opposed to two adults, the second one would create an iser on the first one. The Gemara asks that that's not what the Mishnah said. The Mishnah said bia, so the Gemara says you have to add in a line. It's a chazur machzera. You have to add in the line where it was saying that a bia after a bia of a katan following the maimer of a gadol does take effect. However, the maimer does not take effect. Now, the Gemara says we have a brisa which seems to question this as well. The brisa says if you have a katan who's 9 years and a day, the only soul that he has is bia. You're telling me now that he has a maimer. He has a maimer, but the maimer is weaker. But this Brisa says the only thing he could do is he could do a bia. If he does a bia, that counts as a maimer, that creates a psal. However, an adult brother has 4 things he can do. The adult brother can do bia, which is yibam, maimer, get, or chalitza. Katan can only do bia, nothing else. He has nothing else. So that doesn't fit with what you're telling me, that our Mishnah is talking about bia, and then you have to adjust it, and then the maimer has an effect, but not the same effect. That our Mishnah was really referring to the maimer when it said that his original action, if he was first, it counts. If he was last, it does not count. So what's going on? The Mishnah doesn't fit with you. So the Gemara says the Mishnah was talking about things which have equal effect to an adult brothers. The only thing that he has an equal effect to adults is bia. Anything else that he will do is weaker and doesn't create an isser on them afterwards. That's why it doesn't mention maimer, yibum, or get. The bia is the only thing that is mentioned for him because that's where it's as strong. Now the Gemara says Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, a katan has a get. If he will do a get, it counts. Rav Tachlifa Bar Avimi said he has a maimer, so we have statements of Amayroim. Clearly, this is the halacha. A katan has an effect with his maimer and his get. The only thing the Brisa meant was that it's not as strong as that of the older brother. Says the Gemara, we have a Brisa to support this as well. The Brisa says, the Rabbi Meir says, a katan has a get, and a katan has maimer, it has an effect as well. So there, clearly see that he has all these things. Says the Gemara, hold on a second, you just quoted Rabbi Meir, I have a kasha, because it's a Brisa where Rabbi Meir doesn't seem to hold away. The Brisa quotes Tanakama, says that the bia of a katan counts as a maimer of a gadol. Rabbi Meir says, the chalitza of a katan counts as the get of a gadol. Why do you have to say the get of a gadol? Why don't you have to say that it counts as his own get? It's just as good as his own get. If he has get too, so just say that his chalitza counts. Why do you have to? It counts as good as his get. Why the get of a gadol? That implies that a katan doesn't have a get. So Gemara answers that the reason that we say the get of a gadol is because the chalitza that a katan has is as strong as the get of a gadol, which is stronger than the get of a katan. Katan does have a get, but it's not as strong as the get of a gadol. How is it not strong? So that depends which opinion of Tanaim we're going on. As we've seen earlier, there's a machlokas whether the get follow, whether you could have a get after get, or whether a get after a get has no effect. So according to the opinion, which is Rabban Gamliel, that a get after a get has no effect, that's only a gadol after a gadol. A gadol after a katan does have an effect because the gadol's get is stronger than the katan's get. According to the opinion of the Chachamim, that a get after a get has an effect, that's only a gadol after a gadol or a katan after a katan. A katan after a gadol has no effect. The get of a katan after the get of a gadol has no effect because it's weaker and therefore in the shadows of the get of the gadol. We now begin the next mission, which discusses what happens if you have 2 kitanim, both over age 9, who both did a bia. So it explains it's a machlokes between the Tanakama, the Chachamim, and Rabbi Shimon, how we look at 2 maimers. The same machlokes that we have over 2 maimers, we have over here over the bia of 2 kitanim, which have the halacha of a maimer. So the Tanakama says you view each one as a partial kinyan, and therefore each one leaves room for the kinyan of the other. So when both are done, both are chal, and therefore they both aser each other. They both apply the iser of kivin shabana shuv loy yivne, and they are both aser on whichever wife they have. Now the Mishnah says this is true whether it's 2 yavams doing yibum or 2 yevamos, 2 tsaros getting yibum. Either one that is done twice asers. Now Rabbi Shimon says, no, it's not a question of the first one leaves room for the second one and they're both chal. The first one is a suffix. We don't know exactly how much room it leaves. But however much room it leaves, the second one doesn't have any greater power than the first one. And therefore, the second one doesn't do anything past the second one. The second one has no chalos and does not after the first one. The first one is the one that's chal. So the Gemara quotes, the Gemara begins now, the Gemara quotes the Brayos where Rosh Shimon talks to Chachamim and he says if the bia, the first one counts as a bia, the second one doesn't count as anything because all the bia power, all the room for a chalos bia has already been taken. To whatever extent it counts as a yibum, then there's no room for anything else. And if the bia of the second one, if the bia of the first one is not a bia, then the bia of the second one is not either. It's a suffix, it's not that it's partial. Now, the Gemara points out that this Mishnah doesn't go like Ben Azai because the Mishnah says that there's no difference whether the 2 Bias were done by two different Yevams, or they were done by two different Yevamos, two different Saros. Menashe says there is a difference. He says by Shnei Yevamin, two brothers, it does count, they both count. If it would be two Yevamos, they do not count. Rashi explains that each Yavam has a koach zika, a full koach zika. One is not damaged by the other, and if they both do a bia, there's two full Yevams that happen here. However, the different Yevamos don't have separate koach zikas. There's only one zika that comes from the husband, and therefore once it's used up, there's nothing left in the second one to be used at all. Now we move on to our next mission, which discusses the halacha of a katan who did bia, did yibam, and then he died. So what happens is now his wife, who was originally the wife of his brother, now has a zika of two yivamin on him. She was married to Reuven, he died, so she has a zika to all the brothers. Then Shimon, who was a katan, did yibam, which counts as maimer, and therefore now she has a zika from him also, he died as well. So now she's falling to yibam from two brothers, from Reuven and Shimon, she's falling to Levi. Now we've seen this case earlier in Parak Arba Achen, where it was a maimer that was done by a gadol. Here it's a yibam which is done by a katan, has the same status of a maimer. And the Gemara says it is a machlokes as to whether there's a problem of shnei batim here, whether it's falling from two yibams is a problem or not. So the Tanna Kama holds that it's a problem. Now, Reb Shimon is not brought in here. He argues, he says it's not a problem, but we're not going to see him until later in the Mishnah. So we just have the Tanna Kama here who says that you can't do yibum because there's two different yibums on this woman from two different husbands. She has to get chalitza. She can't do yibum. Now, if the katan who did yibum, who did this bia, which counts as a maimer, if he had another wife, so if he married her when he was a katan, so that marriage doesn't count. Regular kiddushin of a katan counts for nothing. It's only a yibum where it counts as something because he has a chiyuv deraisa, and it's a different kind of a kinyan, and he's empowered to that. But if he married a different woman, there's no marriage, that's nothing, she's pater, she doesn't have to worry about yibum or chalitza or anything. If, however, he married the second woman when he was an adult, that's he did yibum as a katan, and then he married, and then he grew up, and now he married the second woman as an adult. So that woman has a regular zikas yibum or chalitza on her. She falls to yibum to the brothers. She should be able to do yibum or chalitza. However, it really depends what happened with the first wife that he married through a yibum, which counted as a maimer. If he had to be with her after he grew up, so then that's a full-fledged marriage, and now he has two yevamos, and he can do yibum or chalitza to whichever one he wants. If he didn't, though, the only thing that he has on the first wife, who fell to him to yibum, is a maimer. So the halacha is that she requires chalitza and not yibum from the brothers, like we said earlier, because she's coming from two houses. She has two zikas on her. The second one is free because she's nothing. She's a regular marriage. She could do either yibum or chalitza. Now here Reb Shimon argues. Reb Shimon says no. Either one could do yibum. Either one could do chalitza. He doesn't hold of the problem of two houses falling from two yibums is not a thing. So he holds he could do yibum to the first wife. He could do yibum to the second wife. That's not a problem. However, there is a different problem, and that's if you're going to do chalitza to the first wife, you can't do yibum to the second wife, because you can't have a situation where it appears as if there's two women falling to yibum together, and one gets chalitza and the other gets yibum. That is usher. There is a zika though. So what happens is that he has to do yibum first. So he'll do yibum to whichever one he wants. Each one has a full normal yibum. Then he's going to have to do a chalitza to the second one. The reason for that is because they're not really full-fledged tsaros of each other. The first wife is falling to yibum from her first husband. That zika was never really taken off. The only thing that happened to that was a maimer. So that zika is still there, and the zika of the second woman is to the second brother. Nothing ever happened to address that. So they both need something. Can't do yibum to both of them because it looks like shnei batim. Can't do chalitza first and then a yibum. So you got to do yibum first and then a chalitza. Now, the Mishnah ends off with another halacha over here, and it says that all these halachas, which we said about a katan who's 9 years old, applies until he brings shnei saros. So he only becomes a gadol when he either brings simoni that he is a gadol, or until he becomes 20 years old, and then we know he's a Sris, like we said earlier in the Masechta. And we never bring Shnei Saras until age 20, he's considered to be a Katan all the way through. The Gemara now begins, and the Gemara discusses the fact that we said that Zikas Shnei Yibin doesn't work, according to the Chachamim at least. So the Gemara says we said earlier in the Masechta that may have been only Midrabanan as Gzeira. We're afraid that if you do Yibum to the first one and there's a Tzara, you'll do Yibum to the second one, and people will think two Tzaras could both get Yibum. They won't realize that it's Zika from two different marriages. So the Gemara says here, there's clearly, in the first case, is clearly no Tzara. It brings in a Tzara. In the second case, in the first case, it still says that you can't have Yibum. So you see, it's not just Gzeira Midrabanan because of the Tzara. It's even if there's no Tzara, Zikas Shnei Yibum is a problem. It sounds like it's potentially an Isur Deraisa. So the Machlokas Rishonim whether it's Deraisa or Derabanan. Now, the Gemara then mentions the fact that we said that the Katan, if he marries another woman, it's not Chal. So Gemara quotes, there's a Mishnah, there's a Brisa that says that clearly a Shota or a Katan, if they marry a woman, not Chal the marriage, and if they die, there's no Yibum, there's no Chalitza, there's no problem, there's no Chalos to that. Now the Gemara has a question on the case where the Katan grew up and he married a second wife, and we said that second wife could get Yibum. So what's problem is that the first wife has an Isser Shnei Zikos. She has a Zika from her first husband and a Zika from the second husband because the Katan did Bia, which counts as a Maimer. So being that she has an Isser Shnei Yibamin, so she has an Isser, then she can't do Yibum. So the second wife of the Katan, the former Katan, should now be free. She should not be able to do Yibum. Chalitza, okay, she could require, but should block her from doing Yibum as a Tzaras Eishes Shnei Yibamin. That she's a tzara of a woman who's usher, so she should be usher as well. So the Gemara says in Machlokes Rav Yochanan and Rav how to deal with this. Rav says the Maimer of the Katan does the Yibum of the B of the Katan does not count as a Maimer. We've been working under that assumption all along. It's not correct. It's not a Maimer, and therefore there's no two Yibum and there's no problem. Rav Yochanan says no, it does count. So if so, why is she not free? So Gemara says, you're asking the question based on a Brisa in Perek Arba Achen, which said that the Tzara of a woman who has two Zikas on her is usher to do Yibum, but she needs Chalitza. That Brisa is a Tana that argues on this Brisa. That Brisa says we do make Gzeira as on the Tzara, and this Mishnah here says you don't make Gzeira on the Tzara. And that Brisa was talking about a Gadol, and he says it as well for a Katan. And he just happens to be in the case of a Gadol here. Ours is talking about a Katan, and he also says in the case of a Gadol, he would say the same thing on a Maimer of a Gadol. Shnei Yimin, Zikas Shnei Yimin doesn't pater the Tzara. Right, now the Gemara goes into a bit of a Gadati here. The Gemara says that this explanation of Rabbi Yochanan was said in the Beis Medrash by Rabbi Elazar. It's Rabbi Elazar ben Pedas, who's his Talmud. Rabbi Yochanan's Talmud. He didn't say in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. And Rabbi Yochanan heard about that, and he was very upset. So Rav Ami and Rav Asi came to try to appease his anger that he was upset that he wasn't quoted by name. And we'll explain later why that was so important to him. So they told him there was a story that happened in a shul in Tveria where they were discussing the sugya of a lock that's a peg that you place through the door into the ground and it has a head. There's a question whether it's muktzah or not, whether it's an issue of binyan to put it through the floor into the ground. It's like you're attaching to the floor. Anyway, it was a machlokes between Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yosi, and the dispute spiraled out of control, and they got very upset until they ended up tearing a Sefer Torah in anger. Versus they didn't tear it up purposely in anger, but because of the anger, it tore. And Rabbi Yosi ben Kisma commented, he said, I'll be surprised if this shul doesn't end up being a base of a Dezara one day, and indeed it did. So they were trying to tell him, you got to control your anger. So he said, he was even more upset by that because he said, so you're comparing my dispute with Rabbi Elazar, who's my Talmud, to a dispute between two Chaverim, two people who are on equal footing. So not only did he not call me by name, you're putting him on equal level with me. He's my Talmud, we should be viewed differently. So that attempt at appeasing him didn't help. And then Yaakov Bar Idi came, and he tried to appease him, and he said, the pasuk says, Kasher tziva Hashem es Moshe, avdei kein tziva Moshe Yeshua v'chein asa Yeshua. So it says that Moshe commanded everything to Yeshua. Yeshua did everything that Moshe commanded. And the question that he asked is, you think Yeshua quoted him every time he opened his mouth? You think every sentence he said, Moshe said this, Moshe said this, Moshe said this? He said once, I'm telling you over Moshe. And then everybody knew anything Yeshua says afterwards is assumed to be coming from Moshe Rabbeinu. So the same thing is with Rabbi Elazar ben Pedas and you. Everyone knows he's your Talmud. Everyone knows everything he says comes from you. So Rabbi Yochanan was indeed appeased by this. He was very pleased. And he said, that's a very good thing. And then he said to Rav Ami and Rav Asi, why didn't you know how to appease me like Baridi? Why didn't you have a wise argument like they did? Now the Gemara says, why was Rav Yochanan so makbid? Why was he so strict about being quoted by name? The Gemara says, because Rav Yehuda says the name of Rav, that a Talmud Chacham who died and his teachings are said over in his name, it's like he's still alive. His lips move in the grave, as it were. That's learned from the pasuk in Tehillim. It says, "Agura ba'aholcha idlamim, echsa b'seiser kinefecha sela." I live in your tent in worlds. You can't be in two worlds at the same time. How's that possible? So it is, because if after the death, if the Talmud Chacham is in the Olam HaEmes, and he's also in Olam Hazeh because he's being quoted. So the Gemara says that Rabbi Yochanan said the name of Shimon ben Yochai. Like we said, this teaches any Talmud Chacham, and they say over in his name, his lips move in the grave. Rabbi Yitzchak ben Zeira, or possibly Shimon ben Zira, learned it from a different pasuk where it says, "V'chichech kiyein atayiv hoylech ledoidi l'meisharim doivi v'sifsei yishainim." Your palate is like good wine. Going to my beloved, for straight ways the lips of the sleeping ones are moving. That the sleeping one's lips move like the grapes. If you have a big mountain of grapes and it sits together and it starts to rot, as soon as you press it slightly, the wine flows out quickly. In the same way, when you say Talmidei Chachamim, you say anything over in their name, their lips move in the grave in this world.